Every time we think about joy and we think about rejoicing, we don't have any other choice but to ask, suppose the difficult and necessary question: how can we find that joy and rejoice in the midst of sadness, in the midst of chaos, in the midst of events that disrupts our lives, in the midst of intense emotions of hurt and the many that comes with that. And it is such an important question, particularly when you read the Old Testament, the prophets in particular, the likes of Jeremiah and the likes of Lamentations. Obviously, yes, written by the same person, but Habakkuk as well. You find this, what Walter Brueggemann called engaging in the language of imagination. This ability to utilize language in a way that it ignite a thought or ignite a spark that sort of evokes hope, right? But for me, the more I read those portions of scriptures, the more I realize that the secret to developing a joyful life in the midst of any circumstances, or rather in all circumstances, is in perspective, that is consciousness, and secondly, in knowledge and in trust. By consciousness, I mean perspective. It is how you perceive life, how you look at your life, how you look at what is happening in your life. It absolutely matters. Secondly, is what you know about God, what you know, and what you hold as the treasures of knowledge about God. It matters what you know. And we become exposed when we don't know. Certain revelations about who God is sustain us in situations that we cannot be delivered from, in circumstances that we are going to have to be sustained through. Knowledge matters. And then also, lastly, our trust ability, our holding ability. You see, joy is rejoicing in the knowledge, or rather in knowing that God is working all things together for my good, right? Actually, I would say that joy is rejoicing in the knowledge that God is working all things in me for my good. He is working in me to produce. And in order for us to actually come to that full acceptance and joy of that reality, is to begin to think of our salvation as progressive salvation. That it isn't just an event that happened. It isn't just that one experiential time when you accepted the Lord in your life. That justification, that moment of God doing something that justifies us. It goes beyond that. It is understanding that our salvation is progressive. God is working in us, both to will and to do. That we are working out our salvation in fear and in trembling. That there's this progress of sanctification. God is working in us. And as soon as we accept that, yes, our salvation is cemented by God's love in Jesus, but that also it is progressive, that the Spirit is brought into our life to work out certain virtues of God in our lives, then we're able to perceive our lives as God's engineering of ensuring that He's shaping us into a particular mold. In one sense, we can say that we are like, in the words of the prophets, Old Testament prophets, that we are like clay in the hands of the potter, and He's molding us. And that, as long as we are alive, God has engaged, has agreed with us to be involved in the process of being molded, and not just being molded, but being molded, in the words of Paul, to be molded in the image of being conformed in the image of Jesus Christ. And that helps us come to terms with events in our lives, particularly events in our lives that are not pleasant, because we've got to have faith in God, not just in terms of His love for us, and not just in terms of His mighty power, but also in terms of the fact that God is in control, not simply of circumstances or events around us, but particularly that He's holding us, not circumstances, but He's holding us in the very palm of His hands. And that for me is powerful knowledge, because what that then does is this, that whatever else that is happening around us is working to produce in me. God, and we can discuss the details of the statement that God has permitted, allowed certain things to happen so that it can produce in me a certain level of growth, a certain level of not righteousness, but of holiness, right? Of godliness. And so God is working in my life. And so when I go through the mud, when I go through the fires, as Isaiah would put it, and when I go through the storms and when I go through the waters, God is not going to change the waters into concrete so that I walk smoothly. Is that the process of going through the waters has a purpose. And me as a believer who has gotten into this contract with God, basically allow Him to work into my life, to work in my life, to produce whatever He wants to produce. I've got to trust that. And that gives me joy, because then I still see God working in my life. And that is why it is easy for the prophets to make particular statements, such as, that I will trust and I will rejoice in the Lord. I will trust in the God, my salvation. That it begins there. It begins with consciousness, awareness of God. It begins with perspective. As a matter of fact, I think we need to start having more conversations about the fact that God is working in our lives, that God is working in our minds, that God is working in our hearts. Not necessarily that He works inside of us, but that He is actually allowing certain circumstances to present certain levels of pleasure and discomfort so that we are progressing in our emotional growth and we are progressing in our emotional and spiritual growth. And it really does make a huge difference, because it continuously reminds us that we belong to God. You are the best way to ride the winds of chaos is to remember that God is working in you for your own good. Not necessarily for your pleasure, but for your own good. And what God produces, whatever it is the result of our own good, is much deeper than pleasure. I think it was Walter Brueggemann, I forgot who it was, who said that in retrospection, when we think about pleasures in comparison to the fruits of the work of God, pleasure is the lack of hope, the lack of joy. Well, whatever. Forget about that. But there's that. And also it shapes how we also enter into prayer, because there's no doubt that prayer changes things. And again, we come into that language. Prayer changes things. But it isn't just about that. It is that prayer wants to change us as well, because not all circumstances are meant to be changed. Some circumstances are meant to change us. And so perception, awareness, changing how we perceive who God is in our lives and in the world will help us to rejoice. And also, interesting enough, when in the New Testament, particularly in Paul's theology, you understand that joy is something we do. Paul would say to the church in Philippi, rejoice. And I will say it again, rejoice. Do it. By always saying, it's not something that's going to fall on you. You rejoice, and then it will produce joy. You don't rejoice because you're joyful. You rejoice to develop joy.